Alrighty then. So this morning we want to just share some more ideas. These are straight out of the textbook. If you want to read up later in the week, kind of go back and review what you heard here today and what you felt here today, and look at the ideas, the primary source. Go in the Science Mind textbook to where you find the summary of part one. That chapter is called The Nature of Being, and the one right before it, which is about man's relationship with the whole, or man's relationship with God, man's relationship with the universe, different ways of saying it. And I think this is a most important topic for us to consider. And here's the reason that I say that. In all of my years in teaching, in all of my years of speaking and in counseling and working with people, I would say that probably the one thing that almost across the board of everyone that I've ever met, the one thing that we all are working on, myself included, we are all working on this, which is this feeling of worthiness, this feeling of belonging. I'm a part of this feeling that it's okay. It's okay to discover my spiritual nature. It's okay to discover the power of spirit working in me, working as me, working through me. It's a sense of belonging. We have to feel that we belong. We belong to God. We belong to the universe. We belong to each other. I mean, just think of how simple that is. We belong to each other. Can you imagine what that would do for world peace, what that would do for hunger, what that would do for the, the availability of medical care to people who just can't get it? Children all over the world, children in our own country. If we just sensed that we belong to each other, there's not a you and me, there's not even an us. There is just the I am that is expressing itself as us. And in our culture and in the process we're going to talk about in just a moment, the process by which we become individualized expressions of God, there's kind of this necessity of separation, this necessity of the idea of separation. And it's as if what we're doing is we're trying to work our way out of that dream, the dream of separation, the Adam dream, as Joel Goldsmith calls it. If you go back in the Old Testament, there's a part in Genesis where Adam says to God that he's lonely. He needs Eve. And God puts Adam into a deep sleep while God creates Eve. But nowhere in Genesis does it tell us, and nowhere anywhere else in the Bible does it tell us that Adam ever woke up. And Goldsmith puts it this way: we're all stuck in that Adam dream. We're stuck in that dream of separation. We're stuck in that dream that somehow there's a God out there and there's us over here, or maybe there isn't a God, but there's just something out there and there's us over here. And we don't feel like we belong. We don't feel like we're part of it. We feel like either we're victims of it, or we have to be victors over it. We have to have dominion. We have to conquer. We have to struggle. We have to fight. We have to prevail. We have to come out on top. We have to win. And all of those other terms that are so popular in our culture, but are really expressions of ideas of separation. I mean, if you think about it, we even struggle with our own selves. This is the way that our society has taught us. This is the way we have learned. We struggle with our own selves, It's as if there's a war going on inside of us between the angel on one shoulder and the devil on the other shoulder. And we have to force ourselves to do things that are good for us. And we celebrate that in our culture. We set goals and then give ourselves rewards if we make those goals. You know, we have to through discipline, we have to make ourselves get up and do our exercise. We have to struggle to eat the right foods, be on a healthy diet, you know, to develop good habits, to avoid bad habits, and all of these things. And it's the epitome of mankind against itself. Who are we struggling with? Who are these different characters within us that need to compete, that need to dominate, that need to win? So I mentioned this idea of belonging because I think in my experience, in my mind, my way of thinking, if we could all just leave here this morning with just a deeper sense of belonging, a deeper sense of realization that this thing that we call God, whatever it is, it has created us out of itself. We are part of it. We belong to it. It has no idea of separation. It has no idea of self and other. It is all. So it does not know us as something different than it is, as something apart from it. It knows us as it knows itself. And in fact, it is knowing itself and discovering itself uniquely as us. As we look on the world, you know, the divine is discovering itself anew through our eyes as we engage in the experiences of life. The divine is experiencing itself anew. And I guess the best example, you know, I can think of is when you go to the playground or you go to a school with very young children, you know, kindergarten age children, before the system has too much stifled them, I guess. And you watch the children play, you know, and you think of their imagination and you see how they can take something that seems so ordinary to us. We've seen it so many times. They can pick up a blade of grass or a butterfly or a caterpillar, and there's just such awe and such amazement, you know. And each child, each beautiful child is discovering this world, the same world from outside appearances, but totally different for each one. And if you step back and think, but each of those children, each of those little ones is some part of God, some part of the divine. The life that is animating those little bodies is some part of the very spirit of the divine, the soul, we would call it. And if we step back and think about it, we can say, but it is the individualized expression of God that we recognize as this child. That is what is enjoying the world anew. That is what is experiencing the world anew. The divine itself is discovering itself and its creation anew through each and every one. Through each and every one. They each belong to God. They each belong to each other. They each belong to you and I. And you and I belong to each other. It's kind of the mystical unity of life. There is one appearing as many. But if we go back a little bit in consciousness, we can start to experience that one. So I think if we look at life and we look at the great questions of life, the who am I, why am I here, where am I going type of questions in life. I think there is this desire through all history and through all disciplines of thought, whether they be art or whether they be science or whatever they may be. I think they're all different ways of inquiring into this. What is my relationship with this universe? We're like the turtle on the fence post. We're not really sure how we got here, but we're pretty sure we had to have help. How did we get here? Why are we here? Where are we going? These are the really deep questions in life. And I think over the ages, many different religions have come to try to answer the question in their own way. Science tries to look at the how of things, what's going on and how does it happen, kind of the what and the how. And when you get into philosophy, you get more into the why. So science, for example, can tell us that there's a process of evolution, the how. And through this process of evolution, life evolved from the tiniest single-celled organisms. I don't know if you saw it on the internet this week, but now they believe they found evidence of life in rocks that are 4.8 billion years old. Nothing spectacular, nothing like an animal, but it just a tiny tube-shaped creature. I don't know whether it was a plant or a worm or what it was. 4.8 billion years ago. So there was life itself on this planet, expressing itself uniquely in this particular way. And over time, then what happens is that there is some type of an impulse, right? Something that is moving life to evolve in a certain direction, and the organisms get more and more complicated. And some cells get specialized and become organs, and then the different organisms can be made up of different organs. And there's a movement forward, as Thomas Troward would tell us, there's a movement forward in that it seems with every iteration of evolution, where science is telling us how this happened, what happened and how it happened. That's what they're searching for. They don't know exactly how, but they believe what. And Troward would tell us, but if we just step back and look at that with every iteration, with every step forward, no matter how long it took for that step, whether it took 1 million years or 10 million years or 1 billion years, with every step forward, life is moving in a direction of greater awareness and greater freedom. Every step, life goes forward. So we can kind of look and say, well, what might the end point be then? If life is kind of moving along this lines, what might the end point be? And we might say, well, the epitome in that example would be complete awareness, self-realization, complete awareness, and complete freedom. That would be the logical end point. So science can tell us what it's doing. Science can investigate how it's doing, but religion then has to come in and philosophy has to come in and say, but why? Why would that be so? What difference does that make? Why would it benefit anything? Why would life even be compelled to do that? Why doesn't life move sometimes this way and then backwards and go the other way? And all these kinds of questions. And ultimately that gets to the question then of, well, why are we here? Why are we here? Who am I? Why am I here? Where am I going? Do I belong? Do I belong here? Am I here because of just a chemical accident in the universe? Somehow the right combination of chemicals got together and a bolt of lightning energized them and this process of what we called life began? And even if that's how life began, Was there some other power that orchestrated all of these conditions to be in the right place at the right time for the process to begin unfolding? So we start to go back then and think, well, what is this universe? And do I belong? Or am I just a byproduct of it? I'm born, I live, I die, and that's it. After a while, the very ground we're buried in gets folded back under the mantle of the earth and turns to liquid, and there's absolutely no trace of us. And after even more time, the sun explodes, and the very earth that we lived on is absorbed into the furnace. And then after a while, the very galaxy falls into a black hole. Is that all there is? Or is there something more going on, something more that we are a part of, something more that we belong to? So most philosophies start with this idea then that there is something, an intelligence, an awareness, a consciousness. But not just some consciousness, not just some awareness, but all knowledge, all awareness, omniscience. And we call it God. And that it moves, it has will, it has volition, it can choose, it can decide. And it moves by an act of consciousness. It moves by an act of consciousness. Dr. Holmes tells us that that is the ultimate, the only creative power in the universe, thought, consciousness. It's easy to see, if you look here on Earth, it's easy to see that everything that we look around us is a thought that has come into fruition. The houses we live in started as a drawing, and that drawing started in somebody's head. And they laid it out on paper, and they gave it to a builder, and the builder gave it to the subcontractors. And each knew exactly what to do with their part. And the house came into being. But think about this. The house that you live in is a visible idea. It is an idea that has come into fruition. Now, at the human level of cutting timbers with saws and sticking them together with hammers and nails and all those sorts of things, we understand the how. We understand that process. But we don't understand the process by which the thought came. We still don't understand that. Science is focused on what it is looking at, but not necessarily what it is looking with. It's beginning to get there. They're starting to ask these questions. But no one can quite explain, where do thoughts come from? Where do thoughts go? How is it that if I ask you to draw me a plan for a house, you can do that? How can you even understand what I said? How can I even capture the idea and put it into words? How does that happen? We don't know. But the deep thinkers tell us then that there is this something, this power in the universe. We call it God, we can call it first cause, we can call it principle, you can call it nature, you can call it life, you can call it whatever you want. Makes no difference to it, makes every bit of difference to you. But it is consciousness. It is self-awareness. And it thinks, and it chooses, and it decides. And the philosophers tell us to think of God in three aspects: spirit, soul, and body. Father, Holy Ghost, Son. We recognize that there's not three gods. That we kind of talk about the way that it works, the way that we approach it, and we see it from three different levels. But spirit just means that part which is self-aware, which which is thinking, which is choosing, which has will, which has volition, which decides. And you and I can relate to that because we have will, we have volition, we think, we choose, and we decide. And that within us, which thinks and chooses and decides, is spirit in action as us. There is a part of the divine that might be called the soul, it might be called the Holy Spirit, the doer of the word. There is a part of the divine that acts as a blind force, not an ignorant force, a very intelligent force, but it's called a blind force because it only does what it is told. So the self-knowing, self-choosing spirit decides, and then this soul, the creative medium of the universe, the Holy Spirit, the doer of the word, it acts. It takes that declaration, that command, if you want to call it that, of spirit, and it knows exactly what to do and how to do it and when to do it to bring it into actual physical manifestation. The body. The body of God is the universe. The body, the physical demonstration. And as the divine experiences that physical demonstration, the fulfillment of that word that it spoke is accomplished. That my word shall not return unto me void, from Isaiah. Cast your bread upon the waters, and they shall return unto you. The divine is experiencing itself. And this is, if you look in the back of the Science of Mind textbook, if you look in the pages, there's a page of charts. Dr. Holmes called them metaphysical charts. And there's four of them, I think. And it is a circle with two horizontal lines through it. So the circle is divided into equal thirds. And the top represents spirit, and the middle represents soul. And the lower level represents the physical manifestation, the body. And there's a V that comes down through that. And the V coming down represents the involution evolving into the manifestation. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was made flesh. And the part of the V that goes back up is spirit realizing or recognizing or experiencing that which it has created. So get that picture then of the children on the playground, you see. And each little child is a soul, is an individualized expression of God. So in biblical terms, we're told God said, let there be people in our image and likeness. And over billions of years, evolution took a step at a time, a step at a time, a step at a time, until it reached the point of a being capable of self-awareness. Us, our children, each other. And as these little ones are self-aware, as these little ones are experiencing the joy of living, the joy of God's creation, the joy of imagination, all of the sheer joy that the children have, the divine is joyful. The divine is experiencing the joy that it commanded into creation in the beginning. See, they belong, and we belong, and we are created in its image and likeness. So people have been trying to figure this out for as long as there have been people, I think, where do I fit in all this, And over the years, our religions and our philosophies have given us many different ways to think about it. But ultimately, it depends upon each and every one of us to think about it for ourselves, to come to our own realization, to come to our own understanding. So one of the explanations that we have, if you go back and you look at our culture, which comes to us very heavily influenced through Judaism and through Christianity, And there was this concept in Judaism that the human beings, the Jewish race, the human beings, the Israelites, right? There were others at the time. There were other people, but it was the nation of Israel that was selected, chosen, and the God kind of explained to them, this is the way it is. We're going to make a promise with each other, and you do the things that I tell you, and you're going to be prospered because of it. But they didn't do that. Of course, we as human beings never do what we know we ought to do. But they didn't do that. And of course, when they didn't do that, they started to experience negative consequences. And then what would happen is a prophet would come along. Now, our popular understanding or our popular culture considers a prophet to be a person who speaks for God. Like God speaks to the prophet and the prophet tells people this is what God said. I want you to think of a prophet in a slightly different way. A prophet is somebody who understands what's going on. A prophet is somebody who can see what's happening. Kind of a consultant. And tell you this is why things are going the way they are. If you and I went up to the top of a tall mountain and I handed you a quarter and I said, if you fling that quarter as hard as you can off the top of the mountain, I can tell you with all certainty it's going to fall. Am I a prophet? Did God speak to me directly and tell me that? No, I understand how things work. I understand how gravity works. It's inevitable that if you toss that quarter, it's going to fall to the ground. You remember Mark Twain's tale of a Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's court, and excuse me, how he was able to mystify the people because he knew that the eclipse was coming, and he told them he was going to block out the sun. That appears in several different works of fiction in different ways. If you know what's going to happen, it doesn't mean that God is speaking directly to you. It means you know what's going to happen. So the prophet in this way of thinking, the prophet was someone who understand that people brought negative consequences to themselves because they weren't doing things that they were supposed to do. And the prophet went and told them, if you would stop doing these other things and go back to doing the things that you promised God you would do, your situation would change. And of course, almost every time the people did not change, and then there were negative consequences, and the prophet got to be right. In one case, the people actually changed, and the prophet went back to God and complained and said, you're making me look bad here. They didn't get punished like I said they would, but the point is they changed. They stopped doing the things that were bringing themselves destruction. If we move kind of into like the Christian view, and what comes to us largely in our culture, this idea of the fall of man, this idea of the original sin, that Adam and Eve were in the garden and they disobeyed God, and because they disobeyed God, all of humankind is doomed. We're all less than perfect now. We're all less than whole. We can't trust ourselves. We can't trust our own nature until we go through an act of redemption. And again, this idea is that somehow we're separated. In the first idea, people separated from God because they weren't doing the things that they knew they should do. In the second, they're separated from God because of the act of one person, of Adam. This idea of separation. Other teachings tell us, now this comes by way of, these religions are trying to explain why pain and suffering exist. If God is so good and God created us all out of itself, then why do people suffer? And it's because we're separated from God. That's the idea. We're not doing the things we ought to do because sin has entered the world. And we move into a teaching that comes to us that says, well, the real reason is that the God that created this world wasn't the real God. wasn't the ultimate God, wasn't the top God. It was a demigod. It was a mischievous God, and it was a mean God, and that God created this world and set it up so that people would suffer for its own amusement. So that's another way of explaining it. All I'm trying to point out is that people are trying to figure out, where do they fit? Who am I? Why am I here? Where am I going? How does this thing called the universe work? And what has that got to do with me? And my point is that there are many different opinions, many different ways of looking at this. We get into Buddhism, and we get a much different worldview, and we're told, well, we don't know. You see, the game was already in progress when we got here. We were already up, we as the turtles were already up on the fence post when we came into self-awareness, when we became conscious that we were here. We were already up on the fence post. We were already in the Buddhist terms, we were already in this cycle of the wheel of suffering, in this cycle of death and rebirth and coming back over and over and over again. We're stuck in that wheel. And we don't know who started the game, and we don't know why the game was started, but we do know that we can break our way out of it. And the situation is that all of the pain and suffering that we experience are a result of what we have thought. They are a result of erroneous thoughts, beliefs, and emotions. And if we wish to break our way out of that cycle, we must dissolve our erroneous thoughts, beliefs, and emotions. Another way of looking at it. But again, how does this universe work? What is my relationship to it? You're starting to see something emerge, which is that somehow things, we may not understand how everything works, but there are changes that we can make to our consciousness that will change the results that we get. So we can go back to, in the Old Testament way of thinking, we can go back to doing the things that we promised God we could do. In the New Testament way of things, we can accept our salvation. In the Buddhist way of thinking, we can dissolve our erroneous thoughts, beliefs, and emotions. And then we come to where Dr. Holmes has us in these two chapters, And all of this that I've given you so far is just by way of explanation that people have been thinking about this for a long time. And people have come up with different ideas about the way that things work. And Dr. Holmes asks us to take a step back. Take a step back, drop any ideas of superstition, drop any ideas of you shouldn't even ask these things, right? Because that's what fundamentalist religions tell us. Don't even think about this. Don't even talk about this. Just do what we tell you to do, and you'll be okay. And don't even question these things. My goodness. And when I was a kid growing up, we kind of were taught that the Reformation, if you want to call it the Reformation, but this idea that people could go and think for themselves as opposed to just blindly accepting what their church told them. We kind of were taught that started, with Luther and the printing press, and when people started to read the Bible and came up with different interpretations than what their clergy had been giving them, the people claimed for themselves the right to interpret for themselves. And clearly it took a great step forward with the printing press and with Luther, no doubt about it. But people have been thinking for themselves since time began. There never was a time when everybody who considered themselves to be Christian all thought the same way. It just never happened. It just didn't. So we have to remember very, very, very early on, even at the beginning of Christianity, there were differences of opinions. This whole argument between Paul and Peter, Paul was very likely in a school of thought that we would call Gnosticism, the self-knowing. His knowledge of Christ was from an inner experience, not from a direct personal experience. Peter and the other apostles, they knew Jesus personally. So here you have, right from the very beginning, Paul declaring for himself the right to decide for himself through personal experience. So this idea that we need to be able to decide, or we are able to decide for ourselves, it's been with us forever. But the fundamentalist teachings brand that as heresy. You can't do that because you're likely to disagree with what we're telling you, and therefore it's heresy, and it's no good. But nevertheless, we do it. And the reason we do it is curiosity. I think the one characteristic that God gave us that assured all of us would find our way out of the dream, to awaken from the dream, is curiosity. Curiosity, you know. I mean, where there's curiosity, there's hope. Where there's no curiosity, there's nothing, you know. I mean, think of to me, this is my interpretation of Forrest Gump as satire was, you know, he was greatly successful in the world because he never questioned. What his mother told him, well, that was the gospel truth. What his drill sergeant told him, well, that was the gospel truth. What Lieutenant Dan told him, well, that was the gospel truth. What Jenny told him, well, that was the truth. And the irony is that he became extremely wealthy just simply because he never asked, he never challenged. That's the ideal in our world. That's the way that we try to raise our children. Don't ask any questions, just do what you're told and you'll be a great success. Of course that doesn't work because God made us curious. So I think we all feel this curiosity and we start to say, but why? But how? Do I really agree with that? You know. So Dr. Holmes says, step back from the superstition. Don't worry about if somebody tells you you shouldn't think about that, you shouldn't talk about that. You have to think about that. You have to talk about that because you are the only thinker in your universe. And Dr. Holmes asks us to consider there's this thing called God, and we know it in three distinct ways: as spirit, soul, and body, as consciousness, self-awareness, volition, choosing, willing, as blind force or power that does what consciousness tells it to do, but does it in its own way, does it perfectly, but never changes what consciousness tells it to do. In terms of the example he uses, if you put a tomato seed in the ground, you get a tomato plant, you won't get a carrot plant. Right? The blind force of the ground knows how to produce that tomato plant, but it doesn't know how to change it, or it doesn't have the ability to change it into a carrot. So the divine is functioning at the level of soul, self-consciousness, awareness, choice and volition, as blind force or power, or we would call the law of mind, that responds to spirit according to the command and does whatever needs must be in order to produce the demonstration. And then you have the physical level, the demonstration, the actual outpicturing, the actual appearance. And Dr. Holmes says just think about that and realize that that includes you. You're not excluded from that. In fact, you couldn't be excluded from that because that has created you out of itself. And this is what the meaning of created in the image and likeness means. It doesn't mean we look like God. It doesn't mean God has a white beard like me, or I have a white beard like God. It doesn't mean that at all. What is true of the ocean is true of the drop. It means that you and I have will and volition, and we can choose, and when we make up our mind, there's a power that responds to us according to our belief. And then we have the physical outpicturing, the demonstration in our lives. As we have the physical outpicturing or the demonstration in our lives, the divine itself is experiencing that in us, as us, and through us. And because we have come into the world less than fully aware, we have misused the very power that would set us free to produce bondage. Watch the children playing in the playground. They were, in the old days when we were kids, we used to play like it was westerns. You know, we were all the marshal in the town and these things, and the kids would go out and they'd arrest the bad guy, and they'd pretend that they lasso the bad guy with an imaginary rope and lead the bad guy back to jail. All in imagination, no rope, just imagination. And the bad guy would go back to the jail, and then there'd be a little box drawn in the dirt, and the sheriff would say, now you're in jail, you stay in jail. And you watch these kids and they would, they would stay in jail, and nothing there but a line in the dirt, and they would stay in jail. The bondage that we experience in our lives, the struggles, the pain, the suffering, all of those things are not necessary other than they are a result of our own ignorance. And the divine is totally unaffected by those, just as you and I watching children playing in the playground would realize that the experience of being in a pretend jail is not a real experience. So we come to just stop and think and say that, if I turn the stove on and I'm not careful and I brush my hand against the flame, I'll get burnt. But the stove didn't punish me. The stove had no motivation to burn me. The stove didn't lay there and wait, looking, out of the digital clock, just waiting for me to put my hand in and then make the flame bigger and say, I got him. None of that happened. All that happened was I misused the heat. The heat being a blind force. It would cook my food or it would burn my hand, depending upon how I used it. So now, instead of trying to explain pain and suffering as a result of our failure to keep a promise to God, which I suppose, you could say if we misuse the law, you might consider that to be the failure to keep the promise. I don't know. I can see how that could be. We might say then that it is a result of sin. And if you think, well, sin is a mistake, and I made a mistake, and I suffered the consequences of the mistake, then perhaps so. Perhaps it is. Perhaps it was a result of an erroneous thought, belief, or emotion, you see. We come to the realization then that we are not victims of this life, that we are not a chemical accident who just got here and we're born, we live, we suffer, we die, but that we are an integral part of it. We belong, and suffering does not belong in our lives. Pain does not belong in our lives. It doesn't belong in anyone's life. And the only reason that we or anyone else experiences it is through our ignorance and through our ideas of separation. And then our desire, our burning desire in life becomes to explore our spiritual nature, our relationship with the universe, for self-realization, to discover more and more of what God as us is. We can get distracted for a while and say it's to get more stuff in our lives and all these things, and that's okay. We'll do that. It's inevitable. But at some point, we say, the universe has created me out of itself to awaken to that fact that I am part of it. I belong. I belong. And from this moment on, I am winging my way back home. As Rumi says, I am like the moth that is going to go to the flame. Even though I will be totally consumed by the flame, I will do so for that moment of bliss, of complete awareness. Many years ago, I got very interested in ancient navigation, I guess is the best way I could put it. How did the ancient sailors find their way from here to there? In some regards, they followed the coastline. We can understand that. We can understand the Vikings getting to Canada. Following the ice pack, following around Greenland, eventually getting to Canada. It's not too hard to figure that out. How they found it, how they survived the crossing is another story. But how did they get out in the open ocean? And I wondered what would happen if Is there a way that you would know enough that if somebody just dropped you in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean in a boat, that you would be able to figure out where you were and find your way back home? And when I got to looking at it, it really wasn't too hard. The North Star, the elevation of the North Star over the horizon, is your latitude. And if you're in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, if you're going to Europe, you're heading east. If you're going to America, you're heading west. If you know the latitude of the city you're going to, you just sail north or south until the North Star is at the right altitude above the horizon, and then you sail east or west until you hit the coast. That's pretty much what they did. They had a little stick. They would hold that stick up. They would look at the North Star. They put the bottom of the stick on the horizon. And on that stick, they had little lines. And the lines indicated the latitude of the city. When they were in port at that city, they put the line on the stick. So if they're in New York, they could put the New York line on the stick. If they're in Madrid, they could put the Madrid line on the stick. And that was pretty much it. But this idea that, we could find our way home. We could find our way home no matter what, because there was that within us that knew what to do. Dr. Holmes tells us this, Can we trust that no matter what we need to know, no matter where we need to go, no matter what we need to do in order to fulfill our purpose of discovering the very nature of God as us, that we are led to it, that we are guided to it? So I want you to consider this. I ask you to consider this. And this kind of comes to us from some of the stories of the Kabbalah, Jewish mysticism. And the idea was that the Garden of Eden was not a place here on earth, a physical place. But the Garden of Eden represented a time in the evolution of the universe, where the divine, being the divine, had everything. There's nothing you can give to that which has everything. Now remind you, this is a metaphor, this is a story. But the divine had everything. So it tried to create something, it had to create something to which it could give of itself. Because having everything, it didn't need to receive anything, but it could give, and it could experience itself through this giving. So it created the vessels, it created us, it created the soul. And the soul was in the very proximity and vicinity of God. And the soul said, well, I need to empty myself out so that God can give to me. And the souls tried to empty themselves out, but because they were in such direct communication, in such direct contact with God, they couldn't empty themselves out fast enough. As they tried to empty themselves out, the self-givingness of God filled them right back up. And the souls, they overheated and they broke. Again, this is a story. This is a metaphor to try to explain our position in the universe. So the soul said, you know what? Suppose we leave temporarily. Suppose we leave the very presence of God and we go into an experience of separation, an experience of time and space, an experience of distance, an experience of the knowledge of good and evil. And then because we have this appearance of separation, it takes time for God to fill us back up. But in doing so, our gift to God is allowing God the joy, or giving God the joy of giving of itself to us and through us, and then discovering itself as us. And that's when the souls decided to incarnate. See? So imagine this, we're all kind of sitting around in the green room in heaven, and we're waiting to be born, and we're saying, well, where are you going to go? What are you going to do when you get there? And do you think if they dropped you in the middle of the ocean somewhere, you would be able to find your way back home. And we would say, yes, it's inevitable that I find my way back home, because there is that which created me out of itself that is calling me back home. There is that which is revealing to me everything that I need to know to return back home. And I joyfully go into this temporary experience of separation, of letting go of everything that I now know. I joyfully enter into the experience of the dream in full confidence that I shall awaken from the dream, and I shall delight in allowing God to experience itself as me and through me. So this is why I believe Dr. Holmes calls us adventurers in the uncharted territory of mind, spiritual explorers. I invite you this week to feel that you belong, but to feel that it's an adventure, to feel that your curiosity is a gift, to feel that you're discovering your way back home is exactly what you were created to do, and that all of God is for you and none of God is against you, and any of the bumps and the bruises and the pain and the suffering and the tragedies we experience along the way are only incidentals. None of them will alter who and what we are for eternity. So rather than wasting our time on, well, why did that happen? We focus our time and attention on discovering more of God. Our relationship with the whole is that we are a part of it. There's a famous quote from Rumi. It says, "You are not of a drop of the ocean, but you are the whole ocean in a drop." All of God's love is with you. All of God's knowledge is with you. All of God's power is with you. Stop believing in separation. Start believing in belonging. Act as if, and it shall be so. And so it is.